So on a recent video, I mentioned that I had data going back a long way on football matches, and there were a couple of people saying, why would you have that data? What's the relevance of it? And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. So yeah, somebody left a comment on the video saying, why would you bother collecting data that far back? Surely it cannot be relevant. But the interesting thing with collecting data is that, I do it as a matter of course. So football, tennis, racing, I've collected a huge amount of data. I think it's nearly 1 million markets now I've collected data on. And I collect data whether I intend to use it or not. I may use it, I may not use it. And it doesn't mean that I have a particular use for it at any particular time, but you sort of just archive it and then you can go back and revisit it at some point. You'll be amazed how many moments you get when you think about something, you go back and check it, and there it is. Something you've never seen before suddenly leaps out at you. And that's why I archive and collect data. I use it for modeling, but it's also useful to cross-reference and check stuff against and just have a look. And sometimes it explains things that you just didn't see to start with, or you may find something that you're looking at much further down the line and you go back to the data and lo and behold, there it is. You never saw it before and it stood right in front of you. So what I wanted to do was talk to you about that data set, but also highlight something to you that you may not be aware of that actually stands out in that data set as well. Because when I first started collecting data, if we go back a long time ago, I just started backdating data from, I can't remember, it was a long time ago. And I just used to whack it into spreadsheets and, gradually built up a bigger and bigger database. The great thing about the modern world is that data is generally freely accessible all over the place. So there was also a comment on the video saying, do you feel giving away an edge? Well, not really. All I'm doing is interpreting data that's probably out there anyway and showing you, pushing you in the right direction. But if you look at the historical data, there is a lot of information contained in there, which is way beyond the capacity of this video to explain. But I just wanted to highlight one thing to you, because I remember spotting this when I first started collecting data. And if we bring up a chart of how many goals have been scored over a large number of years, I've cut off one side of the graph because that generally is irrelevant. But you can generally see that's what's been happening over the last X number of decades, is that the average number of goals in a match is basically getting smaller and smaller. There are fewer and fewer goals being scored in football matches. Now it has bottomed out a bit, you can see on the graph, but basically that seems to imply that about 2.6 goals is about where matches have settled in the current modern sense. Now the interesting thing about that is if you actually look at the results that sit behind that 2.6 goal data and then start going backwards in history, you'll notice that there is actually a correlation. So one of the first things that I discovered in football and modeling football is how to price the draw. And I figured out very quickly that in fact the draw is much more likely in certain types of matches than others. And what are those matches? Well, if you look at low scoring matches, then necessarily the draw tends to occur much more often. So if you actually look back at the historical data, you can actually see this within the historical data itself. This is a confirming fact that we found within that particular data. If you look at an era where the number of goals scored was quite high, you can see the chance of a draw was quite low. But as we move into the era where goals are less likely, then you tend to find that the chance of a draw increases. So you can immediately form a link there between the number of goals scored in a match and the propensity to draw. Now if you break that down and look at it from a deeper perspective, what you will actually find is pretty obvious overall. If there's a match that is likely to contain 3 goals, you can't divide 3 by half, otherwise you'd end up with 1.5 goals each in a match. And I've never seen a match that's ended up 1.5, 1.5. May have happened in Italian football or somewhere, but it's certainly not something that I've ever seen in the data. It would have to be 2-1 or 0-3 or 3-0 to either side. You can't have a match with 3 goals in it and end up a draw, basically. So if you're forecasting 3 goals, then the chance of a draw drops off pretty dramatically. However, if you're in a very competitive match and you head down towards 2 goals, then obviously 2 goals can be equally shared. So just from a purely mathematical perspective, you can figure out, therefore, that there is a direct correlation between the number of goals in the match and the chance of it drawing. So if you want to do a lay the draw, for example, pick a match where there's likely to be more goals. It's as simple as that. And if you want to avoid matches where there are likely to be less goals, then your strategy there would be less likely to work. But you can actually see that in the historical data. So if you say that collecting historical data is useless, there are some elements to it that are interesting, because that confirms actually what we knew about the draw already. And you can actually see that directly reflected in the data. If you look at the way that the games have progressed over the years, you can see I've also plotted the chance of the home team winning and the away team winning. So you can actually see that overall what's happening is that the away teams are getting stronger. And necessarily that's having an impact in terms of the chance of the draw occurring, because if the away team score first, then the home team are going to try and respond. But if the home team score first, it's harder for the away team to win the match. That's just the way that football goes, because of home advantage and so on. So you can actually see in the data that the chance of the home team winning is weakening a bit, the chance of the away team winning is going up a bit, and that's necessarily influencing the overall number of goals that you're likely to see in a match. If an away team scores in the 60th minute, they may be able to hold on for the win, but it may end up a draw, and so on and so forth. So while this data is very old, and some of the stuff looks less relevant, it actually can give you insights that perhaps you haven't seen before. But necessarily, if you look at the data over the most recent years, you can see that that's beginning to sort of standardize, and that's beginning to show you different traits. But it's interesting to see that, in fact, if you look at you can split it by, I've got this split down by individual tiers, but what you actually notice is that the top tier of football is getting less competitive. In other words, there's a bigger discrepancy between the top teams and the rest of them. But if you look at my video on, is your team going to win the league, then that explains that differential for you as well. So you can see you can begin to link that into there. If you start looking at existing data and correlating it to other stuff that you've looked at, then you can begin to form opinions in terms of why something's happening. And in fact, there is much more information contained within this historical data as well, which tells you a lot about certain characteristics of football and how they've changed over the years. And then you can sort of link that up to why you think that change has taken place, and there are correlations that run across all of it. So it's sort of interesting from that perspective. But obviously, you know, a match between Accrington Stanley and Aston Villa in 1889 is not going to bear much relevance on what happens this weekend. Although if Aston Villa aren't too careful, they may end up playing Accrington Stanley a little bit sooner than we imagined. But when you look at data, it's useful to collect it whether you're going to use it or not, because you can cross-reference it, and when you discover things in the future, you can start looking back at data to understand what the relevance of that is, and there is information contained within there. But what I decided on this video to show you was that if you look, and we'll probably talk about this in more depth at some point, if you look at the correlation of the number of goals to the propensity to draw, you can see a direct correlation there. But you can also explain it. You can actually say, well, hold on a second here, you can't divide 3 by 2, but you can divide 2 by 2 to get 1. And therefore, that gives you some measure in terms of which matches are more or less likely to end up in a draw. So despite being very old, that was one of the first things I spotted when I started looking at historical data, was there was a correlation between those two things. Anyway, hope that's been useful to you. There's a few more videos to do in this series, and I'll attempt to tackle them as I have the time, and as I try and get them into the right sequence to talk you through this type of analysis. Anyway, hope that's been useful for you.